A blade flashes in a palace corridor, and Emperor Caligula falls. The men who strike him down are not foreign assassins or political rivals. They are his own personal bodyguards, the Praetorian Guard. In that single violent moment, these elite soldiers demonstrated they held a power greater than any senator or general, the power to make and break emperors. By the end of this story, you will understand the secret history of how a simple security force became the true masters of Rome, shaping the empire's destiny for over 3 centuries. We will uncover how loyalty was bought and sold from within the emperor's own household, and why the greatest threat to a Roman ruler often slept just outside his bedroom door. What does it truly mean when the guardians become the most dangerous people in the room? The transformation from bodyguard to kingmaker did not happen overnight. It began with a man terrified of repeating his great-uncle's mistakes. The first emperor, Augustus, learned a brutal lesson from the assassination of Julius Caesar. He knew that supreme power made you a target, and that even the Senate floor was not safe. His solution was not a grand army stationed in the capital, but something far more subtle and personal. He created the Praetorian Guard, 9 cohorts of elite soldiers drawn from the most loyal and experienced legions. But Augustus was a master of political theater. He understood that the appearance of power was just as important as power itself. To avoid looking like a military dictator, he did not concentrate his new guard in a single fortress. Instead, he strategically dispersed them in small groups around the city of Rome and in nearby Italian towns. On the surface, this was a gesture of respect for the old Republican traditions, a promise that the emperor was not occupying his own city with soldiers. Yet this clever deception contained the very poison that would eventually corrupt the empire. By scattering them, Augustus gave the Praetorians something far more valuable than a central barracks. He gave them a shared identity separate from the regular army and the people. They were the emperor's men living among the population, a constant, quiet reminder of where the real power lay. And when the time came for them to act as one, they would discover that their unity could dictate the fate of the world. But who were these men handpicked to stand so close to absolute power? They were not ordinary soldiers. To become a Praetorian Guard was to enter the Roman military's most exclusive fraternity. Recruitment was fiercely selective, drawing almost entirely from the heart of Italy itself, or from the most loyal and thoroughly Romanized provinces like Hispania or Gallia Narbonensis. This was the first and most critical filter. These men were chosen not just for their physical strength, but for their cultural and political alignment. They were to be the emperor's men through and through, untainted by distant loyalties or foreign customs. This origin set them apart from the legionaries, who were often recruited from the fringes of the empire and stationed for decades in foreign lands. A Praetorian was from the start a cut above, a citizen of the center of the world, serving at its very core. This elite status came with tangible rewards that made a legionary's pay seem paltry. A Praetorian guardsman earned nearly triple the wages of a regular soldier, and his term of service was shorter, just 16 years compared to the legionaries' grueling 25. Upon honorable discharge, he received a massive cash bonus, a grant of land, and a formal diploma that guaranteed his privileges and Roman citizenship for his children. This was a life of prestige and security, a guaranteed ticket into the comfortable middle class, all for 16 years of service in the world's greatest city. Can you imagine the kind of loyalty that such a privileged position could buy? For the first century of the empire, it bought nearly unshakable devotion. The bargain was clear. The emperor provided wealth and status, and in return, the guard provided their lives as a shield. Yet this privileged life was not easily won. The selection process was only the beginning. Those chosen then faced a training regimen that forged them into one of the ancient world's most formidable fighting units. While a legionary trained for set piece battles on open ground, a Praetorian had to be a master of every form of combat. They drilled incessantly in the tight, chaotic quarters of urban warfare, perfecting the skills needed to clear a packed city street or defend a narrow palace corridor. They were experts with the sword and spear, but also trained in hand-to-hand combat, crowd control, and even espionage. Their role was multifaceted. They were part soldier, part police officer, and part Secret Service agent. This intense, specialized training created a unit that was not only physically superior, but also psychologically conditioned to see themselves as the ultimate guardians of the Roman order. They were the best of the best, living a life of immense privilege, all while holding the life of the most powerful man on earth in their hands. This immense privilege was made concrete in the very walls they called home. While a legionary on the German frontier slept in a leather tent, a Praetorian lived within the Castra Praetoria, a massive, fortified city within the city of Rome. Its imposing brick walls, which still stand in parts of modern Rome, were not just for defense, they were a powerful symbol, a constant physical reminder to every citizen of who truly held the keys to the empire's security. Inside was a self-contained world of order and comfort, with barracks, temples, baths, and granaries, all designed to cater to the needs of its elite inhabitants. This was a life of security and prestige, insulated from the crowded, chaotic streets of the metropolis they policed. The contrast with the common soldier could not have been more stark. A legionary faced 25 long years of grueling service, often stationed in some god-forsaken outpost at the edge of the known world, facing bitter cold, disease, and constant threat of attack. His reward at the end was a modest plot of land, usually in the very province he had spent decades pacifying, a world away from the heart of civilization. The Praetorian, by comparison, served for only 16 years, all within or near the glorious capital itself. He earned a salary that was triple that of his frontier counterpart, a sum so vast it guaranteed a life of comfort not just for him, but for his entire family. Can you comprehend the sheer gravitational pull of such an opportunity? For a young man from Italy, the Praetorian Guard was not just a job, it was a golden ticket, the fastest and most secure path to wealth and social standing in the entire Roman world. This system created a force that was, on the surface, fiercely loyal. Their entire luxurious existence was a direct gift from the emperor, but this very arrangement contained a dangerous flaw. When your entire world, your wealth, and your future are tied to one man, what happens when that man is gone? The loyalty was not to the abstract idea of Rome, but to the individual who signed the paychecks. And as the Guard would soon learn, a new emperor could always offer a better deal. Their duties stretched far beyond the silent corridors of the palace. While standing watch over the emperor was their most sacred task, a Praetorian guardsman was expected to be a master of a dozen other roles, each one critical to the stability of the empire. Imagine the roar of the Colosseum, a sea of 60,000 citizens whipped into a frenzy. It was the Praetorian Guard who formed the invisible ring of steel around the arena, their presence a silent warning against disorder. They were the ultimate crowd control, tasked with preventing a riot that could shake the very foundations of the city. But their work in the shadows was even more consequential. They operated as the emperor's secret police, his eyes and ears on the streets. A Praetorian could be a plainclothes agent, mingling in the forum to overhear a senator's treacherous muttering or investigating a conspiracy within the imperial household itself. They were the enforcers of political silence, the ones who made dissenting voices disappear in the night. This was a power that went far beyond simple security, giving them intimate knowledge of every secret and every scandal in Rome. Their reach even extended to disaster response. When fire broke out in the city's dense, wooden neighborhoods, it was not uncommon to see the distinctive armor of the Guard working alongside the regular fire brigade, the Vigile. They helped contain the blaze and protect imperial property, their discipline making them a formidable force against chaos. And when the emperor took to the field, the Praetorians went with him, not as ceremonial attendants, but as a hardened, elite combat unit. They formed the core of his personal strike force on campaign, their loyalty and skill making them the last line of defense in battle and the first into a breach. This immense portfolio of responsibilities made them indispensable. They were soldiers, spies, police, and firefighters all at once. Can you see how this constant, varied engagement made them not just guardians of a man, but managers of an empire? They knew every facet of Roman power because they were involved in all of them. This deep, intimate involvement in the machinery of state is what gave them the confidence and the audacity to eventually decide who should be running it. Chaos erupted inside the palace. With Caligula dead, the corridors echoed with the frantic footsteps of senators and the clash of rival ambitions. In a side chamber, trembling behind a heavy curtain, was the emperor's uncle, Claudius. Most saw him as a stammering, feeble-minded scholar, a figure of ridicule unfit for power, but the Praetorians saw something else entirely. They saw a blank slate. Here was a man of the imperial bloodline, isolated, vulnerable, and utterly dependent. In that single, opportunistic moment, the Guard's purpose was reborn. They did not restore order for the Senate. They did not search for the ideal leader. They surrounded Claudius, raised him onto their shoulders, and declared him emperor. It was not a request, it was a transaction. The Senate, which had been debating the restoration of the Republic, was suddenly faced with an incontestable fact. The man with the army was now the man with the emperor. Claudius, the man they had dismissed, was suddenly their master, solely because the Praetorian Guard had willed it into existence. This was the birth of the donativum, the accession bonus. Claudius, understanding the source of his power, promised a massive sum of gold to every guardsman, a reward for their loyalty. Can you grasp the seismic shift this caused? The Praetorians had not just protected an emperor, they had created one. They learned that the throne itself was a commodity, and they were its most powerful brokers. This set a precedent more dangerous than any foreign invasion. From that day forward, every new emperor, no matter how legitimate his claim, had to pay the Praetorians for their loyalty. The price of the Roman Empire was no longer measured in blood and sacrifice, but in cold, hard cash. The guardians were no longer just at the door, they were now the gatekeepers. Caligula's murder was not a sudden, impulsive act of madness. It was a calculated business decision. The emperor had pushed his luck, and more importantly, he had pushed his protectors' patience to its absolute limit. The conspirators within the Guard were not fringe malcontents. They were men like Cassius Chaerea, a high-ranking tribune who had personally endured Caligula's relentless humiliations. The emperor mocked his voice, assigned him demeaning tasks, and publicly questioned his courage. For a Praetorian officer, honor was a currency as valuable as gold, and Caligula was bankrupting him. But the insults were only the spark. The real fuel was a profound and growing fear for their own survival. Caligula's reign had descended into a paranoid fantasy. He spoke of making his horse a consul and declared himself a living god, demanding worship from senators and soldiers alike. This was not just insanity, it was a direct threat to the entire structure of power. A ruler who sees himself as a god has no use for mortal laws or mortal bodyguards. The Praetorians saw the writing on the palace wall. An emperor unmoored from reality was an emperor who could order their executions on a whim, or whose actions would inevitably provoke a wider rebellion that would consume them all. Their privileged world was crumbling, and the man they were sworn to protect was the one swinging the hammer. The conspiracy was, in a grimly practical sense, a hostile takeover. They were removing a failing CEO who was driving the company into the ground. The assassination itself was a masterclass in insider access. They struck not on a battlefield, but in a secluded palace corridor during a festival, a place and time where only they could move with such freedom. They used their intimate knowledge of the emperor's schedule and the building's layout to corner him. The very skills Augustus had instilled in them for protection were now perfectly applied to murder. In that bloody moment, the Guard demonstrated the terrifying flip side of their purpose. They were the ultimate specialists in close quarters security, which made them the ultimate specialists in close quarters removal. The lesson was chillingly clear. The loyalty of the Praetorian Guard was not an unbreakable oath. It was a contract, and its terms were subject to renegotiation at the point of a sword. An emperor who failed to uphold his end of the bargain, who threatened their honor, their safety, or their financial future, was no longer their master, but their target. The most dangerous person in Rome was no longer the emperor on the throne, but the man he trusted to stand behind it. Claudius had paid for his throne, and for a time the transaction held. But the precedent of the donativum had transformed the Guard into political speculators, and within 2 decades, they would plunge the entire empire into a bidding war. The year following Nero's suicide was a storm of ambition and steel, a period remembered as the Year of the Four Emperors. The first, Galba, marched into Rome backed by the Spanish legions, but he made a fatal miscalculation. He refused to pay the Praetorian Guard their expected accession bonus, sternly declaring that he chose his soldiers. He did not buy them. It was a principled stand, and it cost him everything. The Praetorians, their financial expectations dashed, immediately began looking for a new candidate, a better investment. They found him in Otho, a scheming noble who had traveled with Galba to Rome. Otho saw the opportunity clearly. He went directly to the Castra Praetoria and made them a simple, irresistible offer, a vast sum of gold for every man paid upon his ascension. The deal was struck. The very next day, the Praetorians marched into the Forum, declared Otho emperor, and cut down the miserly Galba in the street. The message was brutal and unmistakable. The throne was no longer inherited or earned through merit. It was a prize sold at auction, and the Praetorian Guard was running the sale, but the auction was not over. As Otho took power, the German legions had already proclaimed their own commander, Vitellius, as emperor and were marching on Italy. Otho led the Praetorians to meet this threat, but they were defeated at the First Battle of Bedriacum. Seeing his cause was lost, Otho chose suicide, a surprisingly honorable end for a man who had bought his power. The Praetorians, their patron dead, now faced the approaching armies of Vitellius. They had a choice: fight to the last man for a lost cause, or negotiate. They chose to negotiate. They opened the gates of Rome to Vitellius, effectively surrendering the city in exchange for their own safety and undoubtedly a new promise of payment. They had backed 2 losing emperors in a matter of months, yet they emerged with their lives and their privileges intact. This was the ultimate demonstration of their cynical new role. Their loyalty was not to Rome, not to an emperor, but to their own corporate survival. They were the one constant in a revolving door of rulers, yet even Vitellius could not hold the throne. While he celebrated his victory, the Eastern legions declared for their general, Vespasian. As Vespasian's forces, led by his deputy Antonius Primus, swept toward Rome, the Praetorian Guard faced their final test of that bloody year. They had sworn allegiance to Vitellius, but they could see the tide of war turning. In a desperate, last-ditch effort to prove their worth to the incoming regime, they fought Vespasian's troops in a brutal, day-long battle through the streets of Rome itself, even setting the great Temple of Jupiter on fire in the process. But it was too late. Their credibility was gone. They had been revealed as mercenaries who switched sides at the most profitable moment. When Vespasian finally secured power, he understood the problem completely. He could not abolish the Guard, but he could not trust the men who had auctioned the empire. His solution was a purge. He disbanded the existing cohorts and recruited a new Praetorian Guard entirely from his own loyal legions. For the first time, the emperor had remade the Guard in his own image. The Year of the Four Emperors proved the Praetorians could make an emperor, but it also revealed their fatal weakness. Without a unified, legitimate ruler to follow, their power was just another weapon in a civil war, and weapons can always be taken up by a stronger hand. The Guardians had become kingmakers, but in doing so, they had made themselves disposable. Vespasian understood that the Praetorian Guard had become a monster of his own creation. He had used them to secure his throne, but he would not let them control it. His first act was to dissolve the existing cohorts entirely. The men who had auctioned the empire to the highest bidder were cashiered, their careers and privileges abruptly ended. In their place, Vespasian built a new guard from the ground up, recruiting solely from the legions that had proven their loyalty to him during the Civil War. This was more than a simple replacement. It was a deliberate restructuring designed to break the Guard's independent political power. He ensured the new prefects, the commanders of the Guard, were men of proven loyalty, often from the equestrian class, whose fortunes were tied directly to the emperor's favor. For a time, this reset worked. The new Praetorians were Vespasian's men, and they served him with the disciplined focus Augustus had originally intended. But the underlying problem remained. The Guard still held the same physical power, stationed in the same formidable fortress. and they still understood their unique position as the final arbiters of imperial power. The genie could not be put back in the bottle. Vespasian's son, Domitian, inherited this restructured force, and he would test its loyalty to the breaking point. Domitian was a micromanager, a ruler who believed in absolute control and military discipline. He increased the Praetorians' pay, a classic move to secure their allegiance, and he led them on successful military campaigns along the Rhine and Danube. He was, by all accounts, a competent commander-in-chief, yet he was also deeply paranoid, a trait that grew with every real or imagined conspiracy against him. He began to see enemies everywhere, even among his closest advisors and family. His reign transformed into a quiet terror, with senators and officials living in fear of a midnight knock on the door from the emperor's agent. And who were those agents? The Praetorian Guard. They were the ones enforcing his purges, arresting his targets, and standing guard as his private court condemned men to death. Can you feel the irony closing in? The very force Domitian relied upon to protect him from his enemies was the same force that witnessed his growing tyranny firsthand. They saw the fear he instilled, not just in the Senate, but within the palace walls. The man who paid them so well was also the man who was making his own capital a prison. The plot that finally ended Domitian's life was a web woven from his own paranoia. It involved his own wife, several chamberlains from the imperial household, and crucially, the highest ranks of the Praetorian Guard. The prefects themselves, the men Domitian had appointed, became key conspirators. Why would they turn on the emperor who paid and promoted them? Because Domitian's relentless suspicion had finally turned toward them. He had begun to question the loyalty of his own inner circle, and for a Praetorian prefect, that was not an insult, it was a death sentence. They acted not for money this time, but for survival. The assassination was a chilling echo of the past. They used their intimate access, their knowledge of the palace and the emperor's schedule, to corner him in his private chambers. The very men sworn to be his last line of defense became his executioners. In that moment, the lesson of the Flavian dynasty was complete. Vespasian had tried to solve the Praetorian problem with structure and loyalty, but his son proved that no emperor could truly control the power he had given the men who guarded his door. The Guard had learned they could remove a tyrant, but they had also learned they could remove any emperor who made them afraid. The office of Praetorian prefect became the ultimate prize for ambition. These were not mere military commanders. They were the emperor's right hand, managing everything from imperial finances and law courts to the entire administration of the empire. A prefect's power was a shadow version of the emperor's own, and no one demonstrated its terrifying potential more than Lucius alias Sejanus under Emperor Tiberius. Sejanus did not just command the Guard, he reshaped its very structure to serve his own ends. He convinced the traditionally cautious Tiberius to concentrate all 9 Praetorian cohorts into a single massive camp just outside Rome's walls, the Castra Praetoria. This move, presented as a simple efficiency, was a masterstroke of political manipulation. It gave Sejanus direct, centralized control over the entire military force in the capital. He became the sole conduit between the emperor and the men with the swords. But Sejanus wanted more than military command. He systematically isolated the aging Tiberius, encouraging his paranoia and convincing him to retire to the secluded island of Capri. With the emperor absent, Sejanus ruled Rome as a de facto regent. He placed his own men in key positions, controlled the flow of information, and used the Guard to purge his political rivals, accusing them of treason and having them dragged from their homes. His ambition seemed to know no bounds. He even set his sights on the imperial family itself, allegedly orchestrating the death of Tiberius's son and heir, Drusus, to clear his own path to the throne. For years, Sejanus was the most powerful man in the Roman world, the emperor in all but name, his authority enforced by the very guards who had sworn to protect the throne. How could one man rise so high? His power was built entirely on the trust of a single, withdrawn emperor and his absolute command of the Praetorian Guard. Yet this was also his fatal weakness. His entire empire of influence was built on sand. When Tiberius finally grew suspicious, a single secret letter from the island of Capri was all it took. The Senate, at the Praetorians' direction, arrested Sejanus. The very force he had built and commanded turned on him without a second thought. He was strangled in a prison cell, and his body was torn apart by a Roman mob. The fall of Sejanus was a brutal lesson for every emperor who followed. You could give a prefect immense power, but you could never let him forget that it was borrowed power, a gift that could be revoked in an instant. The prefects became both the empire's most indispensable administrators and its most potential tyrants, a paradox that no emperor could ever truly resolve. Sejanus understood that real power did not come from a title, but from controlling the men who held the weapons. His first and most brilliant move was to convince the aging Emperor Tiberius to gather the scattered Praetorian cohorts into a single, fortified camp just beyond the city walls. This was the Castra Praetoria, a fortress whose construction changed the political landscape of Rome forever. No longer were the emperor's protectors dispersed throughout the city, a subtle reminder of his authority. Now they were a single, concentrated army, a fist waiting to be clenched, and Sejanus held the hilt. With this force united under his direct command, his influence over Tiberius became absolute. He preyed upon the emperor's deepening paranoia, whispering of conspiracies in the Senate and even within the imperial family itself. One by one, Sejanus used the guard to eliminate his rivals. Senators were accused of treason on flimsy evidence, dragged from their homes by Praetorian soldiers, and their properties seized. The most chilling target was the emperor's own son, Drusus. Historical sources strongly suggest Sejanus orchestrated his poisoning, methodically removing the legitimate heir to secure his own position. For years, Tiberius remained secluded on the island of Capri, a recluse king manipulated by his most trusted servant. From that distant villa, the emperor signed death warrants penned by Sejanus, each one strengthening the prefect's grip on the empire. Sejanus was no longer just a commander, he was the shadow emperor, and the Praetorians were the instrument of his will. Can you envision the sheer audacity of this climb? A man not born into the royal family, with no claim to the throne, had made himself the second most powerful person in the world through cunning and control of the palace guard. But such a pyramid of power is fragile, built on the shifting sands of one man's trust. The fall was as sudden as the rise. A single, secret message arrived from Capri. Tiberius, finally seeing the monster he had created, communicated not with Sejanus, but directly with the Senate and the other Praetorian officers. In a dramatic session, a letter from the emperor was read aloud, first praising Sejanus before abruptly condemning him as a traitor. The atmosphere in the chamber shattered. The very senators who had feared him now turned on him. The Praetorian troops who had obeyed his every command just hours before now seized him. There was no grand battle, no loyal stand. The power he had wielded evaporated in an instant, proving it was never truly his. He was strangled in a prison dungeon, and his body was given to the mob, who tore it to pieces. The lesson was written in blood for every emperor and every prefect who followed. You could grant a man the power of life and death, but the moment he forgot that it was borrowed power, his own life was forfeit. The Praetorian Guard was a sword that could be wielded by many hands, but it had no loyalty of its own. The auction began not in a public forum, but inside the fortified walls of the Castra Praetoria. Following the assassination of the Emperor Commodus, the Praetorian Guard had eliminated his immediate successor, Pertinax, after he tried to enforce strict military discipline and curb their privileges. With the throne vacant once more, the Guard made a decision that laid bare the brutal reality they had created. They would not accept a new emperor imposed upon them. They would sell the title to the highest bidder. Imagine the scene: two wealthy senators, Didius Julianus and the father-in-law of the murdered Pertinax, Sulpicianus, standing inside the military camp, not debating philosophy or law, but shouting bids against each other for the most powerful office on earth. The Praetorians listened, not as loyal soldiers, but as shareholders evaluating competing buyout offers. They cheered as the price climbed higher, a sum equivalent to several years of their already lavish pay. Finally, Didius Julianus made his winning bid, promising a truly colossal donativum to every single guardsman. The deal was done. The Roman Empire had a new master, not by divine right, by senatorial decree, or by military victory, but because he had offered the best price. Can you comprehend the sheer, breathtaking cynicism of that moment? The very idea of the emperor as the first among equals, the defender of Rome, was stripped away, replaced by the cold logic of a merchant's ledger. Julianus was escorted from the barracks to the Senate, where a terrified assembly ratified the Praetorian sale, but the people of Rome were not shareholders. When Julianus appeared at the palace, the population reacted not with cheers, but with shouts of anger and ridicule. They pelted him with stones and insults, their fury a clear sign that the Praetorians had finally gone too far. They had treated the empire as a private asset, and in doing so, they had broken the last illusion of legitimacy that held the Roman world together. This act of pure greed immediately ignited a fire that would consume the entire empire. In the provinces, 3 powerful generals, each commanding loyal legions, heard the news and refused to accept an emperor chosen by a corrupt auction in Rome. Pescennius Niger was proclaimed emperor by the eastern legions, Claudius Albinus by the armies in Britain, and Septimius Severus by the legions on the Danube. The response was not a political protest, but the immediate mobilization of armies. Septimius Severus, the closest and most decisive of the 3, marched on Rome. He understood the game perfectly. He did not send declarations of war to the Senate. He sent private assurances to the Praetorian Guard, promising them amnesty and a place in his new regime if they would surrender their purchased emperor. The Praetorians, faced with the hardened legions that had spent years fighting on the frontiers, made a cold calculation. Their loyalty to Julianus lasted exactly as long as his money held power. When Severus' army approached the city, they abandoned the man they had made emperor, demanding that the Senate sentence Julianus to death. The throne was taken from him after just 66 days. The Senate, powerless to resist, passed the death sentence, and a Praetorian soldier executed Didius Julianus in his palace. The man who bought the empire learned the hardest lesson of all. You can purchase the throne, but you cannot purchase the loyalty needed to keep it. In the end, the auction had only one true winner. Septimius Severus entered Rome not as a conqueror, but as a restorer of order. His first act was to confront the Praetorian Guard. He ordered the entire corps to assemble on the field outside the city, without their weapons, in full ceremonial dress. He surrounded them with his own Danubian legions, who stood with swords drawn. Then he addressed them. He condemned their corruption, their disloyalty, and the disgrace of the auction. He stripped them of their iconic armor, disbanded the units on the spot, and banished every man from coming within 100 miles of Rome. The Praetorian Guard, the eternal kingmakers, had been utterly and publicly humiliated. In their place, Severus formed a new guard, but this time he recruited exclusively from the ranks of his own most loyal legions. The message was unequivocal. The era of the Praetorian Guard as an independent political force was over. They were to be the emperor's men and nothing more. Septimius Severus had shattered the old guard, but the institution itself was too useful to destroy. His solution was a complete reinvention, a reformation that would change the character of the Praetorians forever. He immediately issued a new recruitment decree, but this time the call did not go out to the young men of Italy. Instead, he opened the ranks to the hardened veterans of his own Danubian legions, the men who had marched with him to seize power. This was a deliberate and profound break from 3 centuries of tradition. The Praetorian Guard was no longer an elite corps drawn from the heart of Italy, imbued with a sense of Roman tradition. It was now a reward for battlefield loyalty, a patronage system for the provincial armies that had backed the winning general. Can you see the fundamental shift this caused? The very identity of the Guard was transformed overnight. These new recruits were not citizens of Rome who saw the emperor as the pinnacle of their own civilization. They were professional soldiers from the frontiers, men whose primary allegiance was to the general who had paid them and promoted them. Their loyalty was to Septimius Severus personally, not to the abstract idea of the emperor or the city of Rome. This move brilliantly secured Severus's own power, but it came at a cost. By diluting the Italian elite character of the Guard, he severed its last connections to the old Republican senatorial class. The Praetorians became even more detached from the people and the Senate they were supposedly protecting. They were now truly the emperor's men, a personal army housed in the capital, their prestige derived solely from his favor. This new model was a military solution to a political problem. Severus prioritized unwavering loyalty over tradition and cultural alignment. He turned the guard into a giant re-enlistment bonus, the ultimate prize for a long-service legionary. This ensured he would have a dependable force in Rome, but it also made the guard more militaristic and less integrated into the civic life of the city. They were an army of occupation within their own capital, a constant reminder that power now flowed not from Rome's ancient institutions, but from the point of a legionary's spear on a distant frontier. The Guardians were now strangers in the city they were meant to guard. A lone Praetorian guardsman stepped forward as the emperor knelt to relieve himself by the roadside. It was the 7th of April, 217, and Emperor Caracalla was campaigning in the eastern provinces. The soldier, a man named Martialis, moved with the casual authority of his rank. In one swift motion, he drew his dagger and plunged it into Caracalla's back. The emperor died instantly, stabbed by the very man sworn to take a blade for him. Martialis' motive was not grand political ideology, but a bitter personal grudge. Caracalla had denied him a promotion to the rank of centurion, a petty slight that cost the most powerful man in the world his life. Yet this was more than a simple crime of passion. Martialis did not act entirely alone. He was part of a wider conspiracy, one that included the Praetorian prefect himself, Marcus Opilius Macrinus. The assassination revealed a chilling truth. By the 3rd century, the relationship between emperor and guard had become so transactional, so devoid of sacred trust, that a personal insult could be reason enough for regicide, provided a powerful patron approved. The Guardians had become so accustomed to wielding power that murdering their emperor now required little more justification than a personal grievance and a political opportunity. The aftermath of the murder was a masterclass in cold political calculation. Prefect Macrinus, the man responsible for the emperor's safety, had orchestrated his death. For 3 days, he managed to conceal the truth, sending out bulletins that Caracalla was merely ill. This gave him time to secure the army's loyalty and position himself as the only viable candidate to prevent chaos. Then, he revealed the assassination, executed the scapegoat Martialis to tie up the loose end, and had himself proclaimed emperor by the legions. Macrinus became the first man in Roman history to rise from the equestrian class, the rank just below senator, to the imperial throne, and he did it entirely through his command of the Praetorian Guard. His ascension was the ultimate fulfillment of the path Sejanus had walked but never completed. A Praetorian prefect had not just controlled the emperor, he had now become the emperor. Can you see the final, logical conclusion of the Guard's power? They were no longer just kingmakers, they had become the throne itself, but the throne built on betrayal is a shaky foundation. Macrinus' reign was short and troubled. He was a bureaucrat, not a soldier, and he immediately angered the army by negotiating a peace treaty with the Parthians that many legionaries saw as dishonorable. More critically, he failed to understand the very nature of the power that had elevated him. He did not distribute a generous enough donativum to the soldiers, a fatal error for a man who knew better than anyone how the game was played. The loyalty he had purchased with the promise of power evaporated when he failed to pay the full price. Within just 14 months, the legions in Syria revolted, proclaiming a 14-year-old boy, a cousin of the murdered Caracalla, as the new emperor. When Macrinus led his Praetorians to confront the rebels, their resolve crumbled. They saw the tide turning, and they abandoned the emperor they had made. Macrinus was captured and executed, his brief rule ending as abruptly as it began. His rise and fall demonstrated the final, grim evolution of the Praetorian Guard's role. They could now create an emperor from within their own ranks, but they could not grant him the legitimacy or the lasting loyalty needed to survive. They were the ultimate political weapon, but a weapon has no allegiance to the hand that wields it. The assassination of Caracalla proved that the Guard's willingness to betray their master was now a permanent, institutionalized feature of Roman power. a rot that would only deepen in the chaotic century to come. The rot set in by the Praetorians now infected the very bloodstream of the empire. The crisis of the 3rd century was a 50-year freefall, a period where the Roman world shattered into 3 warring states, barbarian armies crossed the frontiers at will, and the currency became worthless. In this maelstrom, the imperial throne was not a seat of power but a target. Over 24 men claimed the title of emperor in 5 decades, and most died violently, their reigns measured in months, not years. In Rome, trapped within their fortress, the Praetorian Guard found their power both absolute and utterly meaningless. They could still make an emperor within the city walls, but they could no longer protect him from the rival generals who commanded the real armies on the frontiers. Their world had shrunk to the Castra Praetoria and the palace, a gilded cage where they continued their deadly rituals. An emperor would arrive from the provinces, desperate for legitimacy. He would pay the Praetorians a massive donativum to secure their blessing. For a few months, he would try to govern a collapsing state. Then, news would arrive of a rebellion in Gaul or a usurpation in the east. The emperor would march out to meet this new threat, and the Praetorians, whose duty was to protect his person, would let him go. They were the capital's garrison, not a field army. They would stay behind in Rome, waiting. If their emperor died in battle, as so many did, they simply awaited the next one, ready to swear allegiance to whoever marched through the gates, provided the price was right. They became the ultimate political survivors, their loyalty a temporary contract renewed with each new victor. Can you see the tragic irony? They held the symbolic power of the capital, but the real power had shifted to the legions on the borders. They were still kingmakers, but the kings they made were phantoms, their authority extending barely beyond the city's walls. The ultimate example of this decay came with the reign of Balbinus and Pupienus. In the year 238, the Senate, in a rare moment of defiance, appointed these 2 elderly senators as co-emperors to defy a brutish usurper. But the Senate had no army. The real power still lay with the Guard. The Praetorians despised this senatorial imposition. They saw these bookish old men as illegitimate, a throwback to a republic that no longer existed. For 99 days, Balbinus and Pupienus tried to rule, but they were trapped. They bickered with each other, and the Praetorians watched their every move with open contempt. The end was inevitable. During a festival, the Guard stormed the palace, seized the 2 emperors, dragged them through the streets back to the Castra Praetoria, and tortured them to death before throwing their mutilated bodies onto the public road. This was not a calculated political assassination like the killing of Caligula. This was a savage outburst of pure spite, the act of a force that knew its relevance was fading and hated the world for it. They were no longer the disciplined manipulators of the 1st century. They were a cornered animal, lashing out at the symbols of an order they could no longer control. In their final century, the Praetorian Guard had become a perfect reflection of the empire itself. Once a unified force for stability, it was now a fractured, desperate institution, clinging to a hollowed-out power while the real world burned around it. The Guardians were still the most dangerous men in Rome, but Rome itself was no longer the center of the world. Beyond the gleam of their parade armor and the spectacle of the arena, the Praetorian Guard operated in the city's shadows. Their most feared power was not the sword they carried in the open, but the dagger they held unseen. They were the emperor's secret police, a network of informants and enforcers whose gaze fell upon the most powerful men in Rome. A senator speaking too freely at a dinner party, a wealthy equestrian building a suspiciously large clientele, a general receiving a little too much praise from his troops, all of it was noted, cataloged, and reported back to the Palatine Hill. This intelligence apparatus turned the Guard into the emperor's own ears, allowing him to hear the whispers of treason long before they became shouts of rebellion. Can you feel the chill that must have settled over the Roman elite? The man you drank wine with one evening could be the one who arrested you the next morning. Their methods were as ruthless as they were effective. When a conspiracy was suspected, the Praetorians did not present evidence in a public court. They dragged the accused to the depths of the Castra Praetoria or a secluded chamber in the palace. There, the interrogation began. They were masters of extracting confessions, employing techniques of torture that broke both body and spirit. The goal was not merely to punish, but to uncover every thread of the plot, to name every name. A single suspect could lead to a dozen arrests, each one fueling a cycle of paranoia and denunciation that silenced any potential opposition. This role fundamentally corrupted their purpose. They were no longer just protectors against external threats. They were the creators and managers of an internal terror, the instruments of the emperor's deepest fears. A man like Emperor Domitian, steeped in suspicion, relied on them completely to purge his real and imagined enemies. The Praetorians became the gatekeepers of his sanity, and in doing so, they held the entire political class hostage. Their reputation for ruthless efficiency made them feared, but it also made them universally hated. The very senators who had to bow to the emperor also had to fear the lowliest guardsman, for that guardsman might hold a secret that could end a family's line for generations. This was the true source of their power in the daily life of the empire. It was not just their ability to make an emperor, but their power to break any man who dared to oppose the one on the throne. They were the shadow that stretched from the emperor's shoulder, a darkness that touched every corner of Roman political life. A Praetorian guardsman was a walking emblem of imperial power. His appearance was carefully engineered to command respect and broadcast the might of the man he served. While a common legionary wore a simple tunic and functional armor, the Praetorian was a spectacle of polished metal and intricate detail. His helmet was often more ornate, sometimes topped with a transverse crest of horsehair or feathers, a mark of distinction that made him stand head and shoulders above other soldiers in a crowd. His armor, the famous lorica segmentata made of overlapping steel plates, was kept brilliantly polished, reflecting the sun like a mirror. This was not just for show. That gleam was a psychological weapon, a visible declaration of order, discipline, and immense resources. Can you picture the intimidating effect of a century of these men marching in perfect unison, their armor flashing in the Roman sun? They were not just soldiers, they were a mobile monument. Their most personal symbol was the scorpion. This emblem was etched onto their shields, stamped onto their helmet plaques, and possibly even worn as an insignia. The scorpion was a creature of potent meaning. It was a deadly guardian, a warning that to strike at the emperor was to invite a swift and venomous retaliation. Some historians suggest the symbol was chosen because the first emperor, Augustus, was born under the zodiac sign of Scorpio, forever linking the guard's identity to the founding of the imperial office. Every time a citizen saw that stylized arachnid, they were reminded of the lethal loyalty that surrounded the throne, but the ultimate symbol of their sacred duty was the imperial sigma standard. This was not a simple flag, it was an intricate tapestry, often richly embroidered with gold thread, bearing a portrait of the reigning emperor and his family. This standard was the very soul of the unit. To lose it in battle or through cowardice was the deepest disgrace imaginable. In the field, the sigma was the rallying point, the physical embodiment of their oath. Back in Rome, its presence at a ceremony or in a procession made the emperor's authority tangible, even in his physical absence. The men who guarded this standard were not just protecting a piece of cloth. They were protecting the idea of the empire itself. These symbols, from the gleaming armor to the deadly scorpion, transformed the Praetorian Guard from mere bodyguards into a living, breathing declaration. They were the empire's public face of power, a constant visual reminder that the emperor's will was enforced by the most elite and formidable soldiers in the world. Their iconic armor was not just for palace ceremonies. When the Praetorian Guard marched to war, they were a hammer of disciplined steel, a heavy infantry force without equal in the ancient world. Their primary weapons were the same as those of the legionary, but mastered to a higher degree of lethal efficiency. The pilum, a heavy javelin, was their opening gambit. Each guardsman carried 2 of these specialized throwing spears. Unlike a simple spear, the pilum was engineered with a soft iron shank beneath its pyramidal tip. Upon impact, this shank would bend, making the weapon impossible to throw back, and often weighing down an enemy's shield, forcing him to discard it. A volley of pila from the Praetorians was not just a shower of missiles. It was a systematic act of dismantling the enemy's front line before the swords even clashed. Then came the gladius, This short, double-edged Spanish sword was the soul of Roman close-quarters combat. For a Praetorian, the gladius was not a slashing weapon, it was a tool for precise, brutal stabbing. Their training focused on a simple, gruesome rhythm. Step forward behind the large scutum shield, thrust the point into an exposed belly or throat, then step back into formation. Against a disorganized foe, this methodical butchery was devastatingly effective. Can you hear the sound of that combat, the scrape of shields locking, the guttural shouts, and then the sickening, wet thuds of cold iron finding its mark? This was the reality behind the polished facade. Their tactical doctrine was the same as the legions, but refined. They fought in the famous triple line formation, the triplex Achaies. The youngest and most aggressive soldiers held the front as the Hastati. The seasoned veterans formed the second line as the Principes, and the oldest, most experienced guardsmen made up the final reserve as the Triarii. This system allowed for constant rotation and relentless pressure, a machine that could grind down even the most determined enemy. We saw this machine in its full, terrifying glory during the year of the Four Emperors. At the First Battle of Bedriacum, the Praetorians formed the core of Emperor Otho's army. They were not mere bodyguards that day, they were frontline legionaries, fighting with the same discipline and ferocity they employed in the palace corridors. Though Otho's cause was lost, the Praetorians themselves fought fiercely, their skill and equipment making them a formidable opponent for Vitellius's German legions. Later, when Vespasian's forces stormed Rome, the Praetorians made their final stand not in an open field, but in the urban terrain they knew best. They fought from street to street and from roof to roof, using their mastery of confined spaces to inflict heavy casualties on the invading Danubian legions. In that final, desperate battle for their own fortress, they proved that even when their political power was broken, their military prowess remained absolute. The men who decided the fate of emperors in shadowy conspiracies were the same men who could decide the fate of empires on the battlefield. Inside the Castra Praetoria, life followed the rhythm of a city built for a single purpose. The air smelled of baking bread from the military ovens, leather polish, and the faint, clean scent of the communal baths. The barracks were not the cramped quarters of a frontier fort, but sturdy, well-maintained buildings housing groups of 8 men, a contubernium who cooked, slept, and stood watch together. This was their home, a world of order and privilege, but also of unrelenting discipline. The sound of a centurion's staff tapping on the cobblestones could send a ripple of tension through an entire courtyard, a reminder that the comforts they enjoyed were paid for with absolute obedience. Their day began before dawn, not with the chaotic noise of the city, but with the regimented call of the cornu, the brass horn that dictated every hour. There were weapons to clean, armor to polish to a mirror shine, and endless drills in the sprawling training grounds. A guardsman's prestige was visible in the gleam of his breastplate and the sharpness of his formation. Can you sense the dual nature of this existence? They lived like kings compared to common legionaries, yet every moment was monitored, every action subject to the harshest scrutiny. Their world was a gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. This rigid structure extended to the very god they worshipped. The fortress housed its own temples, sacred spaces dedicated not just to the major Roman gods like Jupiter and Mars, but also to the divine spirit of the emperor himself. Participation in the imperial cult was not optional, it was a core part of their loyalty. To swear an oath in the name of the deified emperor was to bind their sacred duty to their religious faith, making disloyalty not just treason, but sacrilege. The social hierarchy within the walls was a steep pyramid. At the bottom were the new recruits, doing the most menial tasks and earning the least respect. Above them were the immunes, guardsmen with special skills like engineers, clerks, or medical orderlies, who were excused from heavier labor. Then came the principales, the junior officers, the tesserarius who handled the watchwords, the signifer who carried the unit standard, and the optio, the centurion's second in command. At the very top were the centurions and the tribunes, men of immense influence who could dine with senators and whose word could make or break a common soldier's career. This strict order created a state within a state, a society that looked inward for its rules and its rewards. When a guardsman passed through the massive gates of the Castra Praetoria and stepped into the city of Rome, he he was crossing an invisible border. To the average citizen, he was a figure of awe and fear, his polished armor and purposeful stride a mobile symbol of imperial power. He could command a clear path through the crowded, stinking streets simply by his presence. Shopkeepers might offer him a better price, and citizens would step aside, their eyes cast down. This is not respect born of affection, but of trepidation. The people knew these men were the emperor's eyes and ears, the same ones who could drag a dissident from his home in the dead of night. The relationship was one of mutual suspicion. The guardsmen saw the chaotic, teeming city as a place of potential danger and moral corruption, while the citizens saw the fortress on the hill as a seat of unaccountable power. This separation was the Guard's greatest strength and its fatal flaw. It fostered an elite brotherhood, but it also insulated them from the very people they were meant to protect, allowing them to see the empire not as a nation of citizens, but as a prize to be managed. Their loyalty remained locked behind those high brick walls, a commodity to be traded, never truly given. The same Praetorian whose polished armor was a spectacle and a triumph could become an object of pure terror in a city street. For the average Roman citizen, the Guard was a paradox, a necessary evil woven into the fabric of daily life. During the great public games at the Circus Maximus, when the sun beat down on 250,000 screaming spectators, the Praetorians were the thin line between celebration and catastrophe. Their disciplined presence in the aisles was a reassurance, a guarantee that the frantic betting and partisan rivalries would not boil over into a deadly stampede. They were the guardians of public order, the men who kept the city's pulse from racing into chaos. Can you feel the contradiction? The very soldiers who provided this essential security were also the enforcers of the emperor's most unpopular policies. When a new tax was levied to fund a distant war, or when the grain dole was suddenly cut, sparking the threat of famine, it was the Praetorian Guard that was sent into the neighborhoods to quell the unrest. They did not arrive to negotiate. They arrived with clubs and shields, their formation a wall of implacable force pushing back against the desperation of the people. A citizen who cheered them one day for keeping a festival safe might be staring up at their impassive faces from the cobblestones the next, his protest silenced by the very force he relied upon. This dual role created a deep, simmering resentment. The people saw the Guard not as fellow citizens in armor, but as a privileged class utterly removed from their struggles. While a typical Roman family lived in a cramped insula, an apartment building prone to fire and collapse, the Praetorians slept in a clean, secure barracks. While the common man worried about the price of bread, the guardsman received his triple pay and a generous grain ration, his belly always full. The imposing brick walls of the Castra Praetoria were not just a fortress. They were a symbol of this separation, a physical reminder of the two Romes that now existed, one for the emperor's men and one for everyone else. This resentment occasionally flared into open hatred. The public auction of the empire by the Guard was a breaking point. When Didius Julianus, the senator who had literally bought the throne, appeared at the palace, the people did not greet their new emperor. They met him with a barrage of stones and curses, their fury directed not just at him, but at the institution that had made such a farce possible. In that moment, the Praetorians were not protectors, they were traitors who had sold the dignity of Rome itself. Yet, even in their anger, the people were powerless. The Guard's loyalty was a transaction between themselves and the palace, and the citizens were merely the audience, forced to watch a play where they had no lines. The relationship was a fragile, toxic symbiosis. The people needed the Guard's strength to prevent the city from tearing itself apart, and the Guard needed the people's passive acceptance to maintain their luxurious position. It was an uneasy peace, maintained not by mutual respect, but by the cold calculation that open conflict would destroy them both. The Praetorian fortress had cast its long shadow over Roman politics for 3 centuries, but a new sun was rising in the distant provinces. While the Guard entrenched itself within Rome, a different kind of power was coalescing in the north. A young commander named Constantine, son of the Emperor Constantius, was proclaimed emperor by his legions in Britannia. His claim was immediately challenged by Maxentius, the son of a former emperor, who had seized control of Italy and, crucially, the city of Rome itself. This was more than a simple rivalry between two ambitious men. It was a clash of two visions for the empire's future, and the Praetorian Guard made a fateful choice. They threw their full support behind Maxentius, the man who controlled their home, their fortress, and the symbolic heart of the empire they had so long dominated. Can you see the final, fatal gamble? The Guard was betting on the past, on the old power of the capital, and on the man who promised to preserve their privileged world. They were backing the establishment against the outsider. Maxentius, for his part, knew exactly what he was buying. He needed the Praetorians' military skill and their symbolic weight to legitimize his own shaky claim to the throne. In return, he confirmed their immense privileges and swelled their ranks, making them the core of his army. This alliance between the usurper in Rome and the empire's most famous bodyguards seemed, on the surface, a formidable one. They controlled the Eternal City, its vast resources, and its historic prestige. But Constantine was building his power on a different foundation. He drew his strength from the hardened frontier legions of Gaul and Britannia, men who had spent their lives fighting barbarians, not polishing their armor for palace ceremonies. While the Praetorians drilled within the walls of the Castra Praetoria, Constantine's soldiers were marching hundreds of miles, their loyalty forged in camp and on campaign, not purchased in a barracks auction. The stage was set for a confrontation that would decide not only who ruled the empire, but what kind of empire it would be. Would it be the old Rome, governed by tradition and the political manipulations of the Guard, or a new Rome shaped by the raw, frontier energy of a soldier like Constantine? The final act of the Praetorian Guard's long history was about to be written on the banks of the Tiber River, just outside the city walls they had called home for so long. On the morning of October 28, 312, two Roman armies faced each other across the Tiber River. Constantine's veterans from the northern frontiers stood on one side, hardened by years of campaigning beyond the Alps. On the other, defending the city of Rome itself, stood the army of Maxentius, its core formed by the Praetorian Guard in their finest armor, ready to prove they were still the masters of the empire. The Guard was not just fighting for an emperor that day. They were fighting for their own 3 centuries of tradition, for their fortress, for their very reason to exist. Maxentius made a critical mistake. Instead of waiting out a siege behind Rome's formidable Aurelian walls, he was persuaded by omens or by overconfidence to march out and meet Constantine in open battle. He led his forces, with the Praetorians at their heart, across the Milvian Bridge, a keystone crossing on the Tiber. Once across, he then made an even more fateful decision. He ordered a pontoon bridge to be destroyed, cutting off his own line of retreat. It was a classic all-or-nothing gamble, a desperate attempt to inspire his troops to fight to the last. But he had misjudged his opponent and the quality of his own elite troops. Constantine's men were not the undisciplined barbarians the Praetorians might have imagined. They were legionaries like themselves, but tempered in the constant warfare of the northern frontiers, led by a general who claimed divine favor. The battle was a brutal, close-quarters melee, a collision of shield walls and stabbing swords along the riverbank. The Praetorians, for all their training and magnificent equipment, were fundamentally a garrison force. They had not been tested in a large-scale field battle against a determined veteran army in generations. They fought with the courage and discipline they were famous for, their line holding firm against the initial assaults. But Constantine's troops, fueled by the belief that their emperor fought under the sign of the Christian God, pressed the attack with a relentless ferocity. The tide of the battle turned decisively against Maxentius. His auxiliary troops began to break and flee, creating gaps in the line. The Praetorians, now isolated and surrounded, found themselves pressed back toward the raging Tiber. With the stone bridge at their backs and the temporary bridge destroyed, there was nowhere to run. The river became a death trap. Men in heavy armor were pushed into the current and dragged under. Maxentius himself was among the casualties, pulled from his horse and drowned in the muddy waters. His body discovered downstream the next day. The Praetorian Guard, the empire's eternal kingmakers, died to the last man on that riverbank. They chose their emperor, they made their stand, and they were annihilated for it. Constantine entered Rome as its unchallenged master. His first and most symbolic act was to order the systematic demolition of the Castra Praetoria, the fortress that had housed the guard for nearly 300 years. Its high, defiant walls were torn down, a physical declaration that the old power structure was finished. The few surviving Praetorians who had not been at the battle were disbanded and banished. The institution was formally abolished. The guardians were gone. What does the silence of an empty fortress say about the nature of power? For 3 centuries, the Praetorians proved that those who protect the throne can come to control it. But in their final hour, they also discovered a harder truth. No amount of political cunning or barracks intrigue can withstand the simple, final argument of a battlefield lost. Constantine's revenge was swift, thorough, and deeply symbolic. He did not merely defeat the Praetorian Guard on the battlefield, he set out to erase them from history. His first order was the formal and permanent disbandment of the entire corps. Every soldier who had survived the massacre at the Milvian Bridge was stripped of his rank, his privileges, and his iconic armor. There would be no new recruitment, no reconstitution. The 300-year-old institution was simply terminated, but Constantine understood that symbols held power, and the greatest symbol of the Guard's enduring threat was the Castra Praetoria itself. He gave the command for its systematic demolition. Can you hear the sound of pickaxes striking those imposing brick walls that had dominated the city's landscape for centuries? The fortress that had been a state within a state, the nerve center of countless conspiracies and the source of the Guard's arrogant power, was methodically torn down. Its stones were repurposed for other buildings, its ground reclaimed. This was not just demolition, it was a deliberate act of political erasure, a message carved into the very fabric of Rome. The men who had once formed the Guard were not executed, but their punishment was in many ways more profound. They were scattered to the distant frontiers of the empire, posted to legions along the Rhine or in the deserts of the east. These former elites, accustomed to the comforts and influence of the capital, were now just common soldiers in remote, dangerous outposts. Their golden ticket was torn up, their privileged world vanished overnight. In one sweeping series of actions, Constantine solved the Praetorian problem that had plagued emperors for generations. He demonstrated that the power to make emperors was an illusion when faced with an emperor who commanded the real armies. The Guardians were not just defeated, they were unmade, their legacy reduced to rubble and memory. The empty space where their fortress once stood became the most powerful monument of all, a silent testament to the fact that in the end, the throne had finally found a way to break its most dangerous protectors. Their 3-century saga leaves us with a profound and unsettling question. How does an institution created to ensure stability become the primary source of chaos? The Praetorian Guard began as a brilliant solution to a real problem, a professional force to protect the emperor from the kind of political violence that killed Julius Caesar. Yet in perfecting the art of protection, they inadvertently created a new, more insidious threat. They became a paradox, a stabilizing force that was inherently destabilizing, their very existence a temptation to absolute power. Their story is a masterclass in the law of unintended consequences, where a simple, logical idea curdles into a systemic poison over generations. The fatal flaw was never the concept of a bodyguard, but the unchecked concentration of power Augustus placed in their hand. By making them the sole arbiters of imperial safety, he gave them a veto over the entire political system. Can any institution wield such influence without eventually being corrupted by it? The Guard's history answers with a resounding no. Their evolution from protectors to kingmakers, and finally to pariahs, maps the slow decay of their original purpose. They were meant to serve the empire, but they learned to serve themselves, treating the throne as a financial asset and the empire as their private estate. This transformation offers a timeless lesson about power. It shows that when a protective force becomes too powerful, too separate from the society it guards, its loyalty can easily shift from the institution to its own self-interest. The men stationed outside the emperor's door came to realize they did not just hold his life in their hands. They held the future of Rome itself, and that was a realization too tempting for any group of humans to resist. Their ultimate fate at the Milvian Bridge was not just a military defeat. It was the final, logical conclusion of their journey. An institution that had spent centuries placing its own survival above the health of the state was finally confronted by a power that placed the state above all else. In the end, the Praetorian Guard was not defeated by Constantine's army alone. They were defeated by the inevitable consequences of their own corrosive power, a warning that echoes far beyond the ruins of their fortress. Their long journey from palace defenders to imperial executioners reveals a pattern as old as power itself. The Praetorian Guard story is the ultimate historical paradox, a 300-year lesson in how the very force designed to ensure stability can become the engine of its destruction. They began as Augustus' brilliant solution, an elite shield against the chaos of assassination. Yet with each passing generation, that shield grew heavier, until the men who carried it realized they could use it not to protect the throne, but to control who sat upon it. Their loyalty, once an unbreakable oath, was slowly priced and sold, transforming from a sacred duty into a cynical transaction. The scorpion sting, meant for the emperor's enemies, was ultimately turned upon the emperor himself, time and again. Their final, defiant stand at the Milvian Bridge was the last gasp of an institution that had forgotten its purpose, destroyed by the very kind of raw military power it had once manipulated from the shadows. This arc forces us to confront a difficult truth about concentrated power. When guardians are granted too much influence, too much privilege, and too much proximity to absolute authority, their loyalty can curdle into a weapon. The thirst for control can corrupt even the most solemn vows, turning protectors into the most perilous threat of all. It is a cycle that has repeated itself throughout history, but never with such dramatic and world-altering consequences as in the halls of ancient Rome. We would love to hear your thoughts on this epic saga. Which Roman emperor you believe was most tragically at the mercy of the men he trusted to stand guard at his door? Share your perspective in the comments below.